Welcome to Kontext TV. 1 year ago, the revolution in Egypt started, leading to the downfall of President Mubarak. But the military is still in power. Security forces have cracked down heavily on protesters. The result, dozens of dead and injured people and more than 12,000 military lawsuits without due process against civilians, more than ever before. The former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency and Nobel laureate Mohamed el-Baradei withdrew his running for presidency. Quote, "There is no transition to democracy." Our guest now is Sharif Abdel Kouddous in Cairo. Kouddous reports for the independent US-newscast Democracynow on the Arab revolts. He's also fellow at the Nation Institute and writes for several newspapers in Egypt and the US, including The Progressive, The Nation and Egypt Independent.
Welcome to Kontext TV, Sharif. 1 year ago, the revolution in Egypt started, leading to the downfall of President Mubarak. What is your assessment of this revolution so far? What has been achieved in terms of social justice and political rights? Is there more than an exchange of faces?
Well, the revolution certainly achieved its first big obstacle in toppling the Mubarak regime and Hosni Mubarak being forced out of office and most of his cronies, as well as dissolving parliament that was elected in a very rigged election and dissolving his party. Since February 11th, when the Supreme Council of Armed Forces took power, we've seen a variety of different ways of repression and of trying to stem the revolution. The Supreme Council of Armed Forces is headed up by Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi, who was Mubarak's loyal defense minister for 20 years. One of their first statements since coming to power in February, the Supreme Council said they pledged to continue to protect protesters regardless of their rights. 1 week later, on February 25th, they reneged on that pledge and forcibly dispersed a sit-in in front of the cabinet. And since then, we have seen violent assaults on protesters almost every single month in the past year that's happened. On March 9th, we saw a very vicious one where they attacked a sit-in in Tahrir Square. People who were arrested were beaten very badly. And some were even, women were subjected to forced virginity tests. And we've seen this pattern of a denial of any kind of dissent continue throughout the year. And then particularly in the last 3 months, the violence has really escalated. We've seen about 90 people be killed in protests just in the past 3 months alone. The single bloodiest day over the past year was October 9th, when army soldiers attacked a demonstration of Coptic Christians that resulted in the killing of 27 people and the injuring of 300. A month later, we saw clashes near Tahrir Square that centered on Mohamed Mahmoud Street with Central Security Forces, who are the riot police, where they fired for 5 continuous days, tear gas continuously. 45 people were killed. Many hundreds, if not thousands, were wounded. And most recently, of course, we saw clashes in front of Parliament where the army themselves, and this really marked the longest sustained battle with army soldiers and not riot police. Army soldiers beat and assaulted protesters. And of course, we have the famous photo of the woman with her chest and bra exposed being stomped on by soldiers that really made headlines and outraged the world. So on the point of the right to dissent, the right to peacefully protest, we have not seen much gain in Egypt. The Supreme Council of Armed Forces has really attempted to quash dissent and quash protests that have come up against their rule. I think what we've seen a big gain within the labor movement. The labor movement, of course, laid the groundwork for this revolution. For years, they've been participating in strikes and sit-ins, as many as 2 million workers over the past 10 years. And what happened was the Egyptian General Federation of Trade Unions, which was instituted under Abdel Nasser, which basically regulated all organized labor and really didn't represent workers, but really acted as a way of informing on worker potential strikes to the state. This was dissolved. And an independent federation of trade unions has begun. It has over 1 million members. When we started this revolution, we had 4 independent unions. Now we have well over 100. So these are big gains in the labor movement. However, key demands of the labor movement, including a minimum wage and a maximum wage, have not been enacted. The interim cabinet did put forward a minimum wage which was less than what workers were demanding. However, this has not really been affected on the ground. Another key aspect that's important to consider here is the treatment of the media. Mubarak used a variety of different methods to control and keep in place any kind of opposition. We've seen really an escalation on this kind of suppression by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. Over the past 10 months, 11 months since they came to power in February, we've seen them assault journalists who are covering protesters. Journalists who criticized them have been summoned to the military prosecutor. They have jailed bloggers, most famously a young blogger called Michael Nabil, who was sentenced to 3 years in prison by a military court for quote-unquote insulting the army. We've seen them raid TV stations while they were live on the air. We've seen them censor newspapers and pull publications off the stands. So really they're trying to control the information, and at the same time they're making very vicious use of the state propaganda apparatus, which has moved from acting as a mouthpiece for the Mubarak regime to acting as a mouthpiece for the Supreme Council of Armed Forces and the military, and they engage in demonizing protesters and in pushing this theory of a foreign conspiracy that wants to topple the state that the Supreme Council keeps on pushing forward. And then perhaps most egregiously, what we've seen over these past this year of being ruled by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces has been the use of military trials. In the first, from January through to late August, early September, no less than 12,000 civilians were put on military trial. These are unfair courts by most international standards. Almost nearly all of them were convicted. Many were sentenced to jail terms of a few months, ranging to a few years to several years. And so this has been, and this is more military trials than the entire almost 30 years of the Mubarak regime. So I think in general we've seen things either stay the same or even deteriorate in many levels. What has changed, of course, is the revolutionary atmosphere of people on the ground, of civil society groups, of activist groups, of independent media. All of these things are really burgeoning and growing, and I think it's going to be very hard for the Supreme Council to actually stop this revolution from continuing. We're a year from when it began, and it still is very much in motion. I've mentioned all of these forms of repression that have happened, but in their wake, there have also been resistance, very strong resistance to them. So in the wake of this violence, people still continue to protest and take to the streets, and they're unafraid. In fact, when there is any kind of violence on protesters, more people come in solidarity. And so this is the kind of atmosphere we're in. We're seeing a new independent media movement that's happening here that's very exciting. The Supreme Council denies any wrongdoing whenever they kill protesters. They deny shooting at protesters even when there's very clear video evidence to the contrary. And what activists have done, and of course the state media propagates these lies. So what activists have done have really to reclaim public spaces in cities across the country. They've launched a campaign called Askar Kazzabun, which means the military are liars. And what they do is they take portable video equipment, they set up a screen in a public square or on a sidewalk, and they air footage of military abuses against protesters, of military abuses interlaced with denials by the Supreme Council of any wrongdoing. These are usually followed by discussions and marches. So this is happening right now. There's several a day in every governorate in Egypt. There's also activists, of course, making use of social media that they have in the past. So it's been a very tough year, a very pivotal year. But I think what many activists say is that they want to reignite the revolution again on this January 25th and to continue its goals. And I think, just on a final point, that when this revolution began, it really targeted the Mubarak regime. Its demands were for bread, freedom, and social justice, and they were demanding the toppling of the regime. And I don't think when this first started that many people were really considering what is now obvious is that the backbone of the regime, the backbone of autocracy in Egypt really for the past 60 years, which is the military. And right now the revolution is becoming more radical and targeting the military and trying to really break this backbone that has a hold on the economy of somewhere between 15 and 35%. It's opaque, so people don't really know, which really has served to act as a state within the state that has its own special autonomy, that has its own special economic and political privileges. And so right now the constitution is supposed to be drawn up in these coming months. The military has made it very clear that they want these privileges protected in the constitution. And this is where the battle is forming now, almost a year after this revolution began.
The military in Egypt is heavily funded by the US. Is this an issue in the protest movements?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, there's no question that the military, which is accusing groups here of receiving foreign funding, is one that receives $1.3 billion from the United States. This military really doesn't, the function that it does, acts as really they have factories with conscripted labor here. They produce bottled water. They're the biggest seller of real estate in Egypt. They produce machine parts. They produce olive oil. So it's really it has a stranglehold on the economy. And many of these generals and SCAF members themselves enjoy very high privileges. They live a life apart in their own separate housing units, which have duty-free goods, and so they're living like the regime used to, Mubarak. It's just that they were untouched and unseen in the public sphere. But I think now that their face is more aware, people are now targeting that, and they see that the funding, if the US is going to fund them for that much, that really should seep somehow into the Egyptian economy. If it doesn't, then the funding should stop. Many Egyptians, of course, do not support US foreign policy. They do not support Israeli policy. They did not support the invasion of Iraq. They did not support the siege of Gaza. These things were seen as a shame on Egyptians. Gaza is encircled by Israel. The only border that's not with Israel is with Egypt. And Mubarak, at the bidding of the United States, closed down that border and was complicit in the siege on Gaza. So, of course, these things are come into play, and many people see that the funding was a way of keeping Mubarak and the military in line.